is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
If I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Thursday, June 29th, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Andrew Seaton, author of Our NHS, The History of Britain's Best-Loved Institution. And later in the show, Camille Rey, mother of Leon, her trans child, joins us to talk about their family's decision to flee Texas. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court strikes down race-based affirmative action in college admissions along liberal and conservative lines 6-3. There are air quality alerts in 20 U.S. states today because of Canadian wildfires. Stay safe, everybody, please. Some rare good news for DeSantis. He leads Trump in Wisconsin for now. Ooh. But still trails him in pretty much every other important state. Speaking of DeSantis, the governor reportedly steered over $90 million in leftover COVID stimulus to one of his top donors, a housing developer. Over half of the public believes Trump did something illegal in the documents case, AP poll finds. Rolling Stone reports Trump tried to get the docs back after he knew he was being indicted. He is a nutjob. Raffensperger, Georgia Secretary of State, interviewed by federal prosecutors in their election probe. Remember, that was the guy who Trump called asking for him to find some votes. Biden and the Democrats have now appointed 100 district court judges, outpacing the Trump era. Judges are important. 2 in Kentucky and Tennessee just temporarily blocked portions of the trans-affirming care bans in the states. A professor and 2 students stabbed in gender classes in Canada. Still figuring out the details of that case. Motive. New York City now has a record of 100,000 people in homeless shelters, partially due to an influx in migrants. And then also just inability to live in the city financially. Daniel Penny pleads not guilty to manslaughter. 180 arrested in France after another night of protests over a cop killing a 17-year-old. And lastly, DoorDash to offer workers hourly pay instead of per delivery earnings. This is after New York City passed a minimum wage for delivery drivers. So that is some good news. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome to the show, everybody. It's an EmMajority Report Thursday. Sam is out for the rest of the week. Just myself tomorrow with my buddies over here, Matt and Bradley. Say hello, buddies.
Hello. Hi.
Okay.
Good morning.
Yeah, bring the enthusiasm,
morning?
please. I need some energy.
What's up? I can't hear you.
Sorry, clapping on the podcast is probably not the right thing. I'm sorry for everybody listening on headphones. We got some predictable bad news this morning. This seemed like it was going to be the obvious conclusion. The Supreme Court has struck down race-based affirmative action in college admissions 6-3 along
reveling in point.
It's okay. I thought that was a sound drop. It's just DeSantis's nasally voice. No, I mean, so 6-3, they shut down race-based affirmative action in college admissions. And Roberts wrote the majority opinion. He and the conservatives all sided on that side, and then it was Sotomayor, Kagan, and KBJ dissenting. And essentially, he decided, or the court's opinion was that Harvard and UNC, the two cases that were brought together, that their race-conscious admissions and the policies taking race into account when admitting kids into their schools violates the Equal Protection Clause, which is a complete inversion of the Equal Protection Clause. That amendment was written explicitly to make sure that racism and the context imbued in systemic racism in this country was taken into account. Like, that is the actual intent of it.
This is the MLK said, "Don't look at race." The judicial decision.
Right. Exactly. Yes, it is it's an inversion of the original intent of like what anti-racist work actually looks like. It's a good point about MLK. That it is contrary to what the amendment was supposed to do. And I just want to ask these conservatives, what happened to original intent? Like, I mean, their concept of originalism is just basically how can we make originalism actionable in a way that allows us to interpret things in the most racist context? And then we can just smooth it over by imbuing it with this sense of like American patriotism and mysticism.
Yeah, I mean,
that the founding fathers or whoever wrote this sacred legislation, what their intention was, but they'll completely disregard it in every other instance. Well, it's about race or gender. It's reactionary politics disguised as sound legal theory.
Well, I mean, the originalism thing, like Clarence Thomas is again like redefining like Friedman and in a way that makes this possible. Like they still say they believe in originalism, but what they mean by the original is whatever mythology is in their head that is useful for what they're seeking.
Right. And it's funny though that they didn't rule on legacy admissions, right?
Yeah.
Huh. It's odd. Why would that be?
I am somebody who am fairly certain that I was accepted to both New York University and Pepperdine when I wasn't accepted to closer schools, even though NYU and Pepperdine were the most prestigious that I applied to. But I'm pretty sure that I got in them because they don't have a whole lot of North Dakotans there. That wasn't ruled on.
Exactly. In fact, it's kind of explicitly stated that other contexts, even surrounding race, adjacent to race, can be taken into account, but just not race because, that's racist. To take into account the broader history of systemic racism in this country, that is racist. Acknowledging our racist history is racist. That's really what this decision boils down to. Yeah. This is Roberts' bizarre context or bizarre majority opinion in which he acknowledges that affirmative action programs are meant to be vehicles for the context I described. They take into account the fact that certain groups have certain advantages. And Roberts didn't even dispute that here. This was his majority opinion. At the same time, as all parties agree, nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an application's decision of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. But what? A benefit to a student who overcame racial discrimination, for example, might be tied to that student's courage and determination, or a benefit to a student whose heritage or culture motivated him or her to assume a leadership role or attain a particular goal must be tied to that student's unique ability to contribute to the university. In other words, the student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. I mean, that is complete gobbledygook.
So bootstraps.
Yeah. So as long as you are sufficiently, the university has deemed that you are sufficiently motivated to overcome your background, then that can be taken into account. But I mean, it's a complete straw man that he is arguing against here, because universities aren't just admitting people because they're black. They're not just admitting people because they're indigenous. They're not just admitting people because they're Hispanic or Latino. They're admitting people based on a confluence of factors. And race is a factor that is considered. So what he is describing, in his opinion, overturning the constitutionality of affirmative action in college admissions, is the exact standard that was used where race was one of the factors being considered within the context of the broader individual and the student and what they can contribute to the university. So they are overturning a precedent based on a complete fallacy. And let's just read a little bit of what Ketanji Brown Jackson had to say in her dissenting opinion. Sotomayor also had a very good one as well. This is KBJ. This contention blinks both history and reality in ways too numerous to count. But the response is simple. Our country has never been colorblind. Given the lengthy history of state-sponsored race-based preferences in America, to say that anyone is now victimized if a college considers whether that legacy of discrimination has uniquely advantaged its applicants fails to acknowledge the well-documented intergenerational transmission of inequality that still plagues our citizenry. It is that inequality that admissions programs such as UNC's help to address to the benefit of us all. Because the majority's judgment stunts that progress without any basis in law, history, logic, or justice, I dissent. Wait, okay, so this is actually Sotomayor.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's Sotomayor. This is Jackson's. This is KBJ? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Okay, I apologize. All right, here she continues. The court has come to rest on the bottom line conclusion that racial diversity in higher education is only worth potentially preserving insofar as it might be needed to prepare Black Americans and other underrepresented minorities for success in the bunker, not the boardroom, a particularly awkward place to land in light of the history the majority opts to ignore. It would be deeply unfortunate if the Equal Protection Clause actually demanded this perverse, ahistorical, and counterproductive outcome. To impose this result is in that clause's name when it requires no such thing, and to thereby obstruct our collective progress toward the full realization of the clause's promise is truly a tragedy for us all. And there she is doing a very good job turning their logic on themselves. If original intent in the framing of our Constitution is the guidepost for these conservatives, then this flies completely directly in the face of the original intent. This is all she can do, is call them out on their hypocrisy. But from the outside, what we can say is they are political reactionaries pretending that they have a principle in order to achieve the end that they want. And the plaintiffs that brought this case cynically used Asian Americans as a cudgel against other minorities by saying that they were the ones being harmed by these kinds of admission standards because of certain testing categories and stuff. And I've seen immense solidarity online from a lot of other Asian Americans saying we do not accept this premise. But it was just a well-funded conservative effort that used that as the spine of an ahistorical racist argument.
Yeah, like this sort of supposed race blindness is not a good sign. Like you see this, I saw in the Minneapolis police report that came out recently, the cops themselves were saying these are poverty problems. These aren't cop abuse problems.
Sure.
And like I think like. And we had a comment here, like, what if we all recognize we were the same and there are no races? Is this racist? Yeah. And the simple answer is this. We are all the same in terms of being humans. And, like, phenotypical differences are exceedingly small. And anyone who thinks that they're the cause for, like, differences in material outcomes in society is a racist. We are the same in terms of human, but we are not the same in terms of investment. And look, these sorts of things where we reward folks from underinvested communities with getting into Ivy Leagues, like that's better than not doing that. fundamentally we need to be investing in communities before, way before they excel in high school. But
and way before it needs to be just like the select star coming out of X neighborhood,
right.
and that proves the myth of like American kind of work hard and achieve mentality,
right?
Meritocracy.
And so like now it's like, well, these Ivies are going to have a big PR problems. One, because they're not able to. They're going to be reproducing what they were initially made to reproduce, which is the class structure of wealthy people in this country.
And that's what this was.
Yep.
That was what this was. It's an attempt to slow down progress of using colleges as means to create more social mobility and class mobility, and they try to put an albatross on people's necks in the form of student debt, so that hampers class mobility and social mobility and all the racial elements that are tied into that as well. And then they're trying to do it as well with completely inverting the intention of the 14th Amendment in order to cement a white power structure.
Yeah, and this will
just
go to naturalize basically a Charles Murray view of race in this country, which is that if they were good enough to get into those colleges, they'd be in them.
Right. Mm-hmm. All right, guys. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to be joined by Andrew Seaton. We are back, and we are joined now by Andrew Seaton, junior research fellow in history at St. Anne's College, author of Our NHS, A History of Britain's Best Loved Institution. Andrew, thanks so much for coming on today.
Hi, Emma. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
For sure. So the NHS turned 75 this year. It's beloved by the public and constantly under threat by conservatives, which is a similar story to the one that we see here in the U.S. about Medicare and Social Security. What would you say is the threat level that we're at right now with the NHS in the UK?
I mean, I think we're in a really difficult moment with the NHS this year in particular. So obviously, we're sort of in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of kind of pre-existing issues that were there with things like funding, waiting lists, this kind of stuff have only sort of been exacerbated by the experience of the pandemic. And we're sort of coming out the other side, and there's huge sort of red lights sort of glaring on many different metrics in the NHS at the moment, from waiting times, waiting lists, ambulance times, this kind of thing. And obviously these things kind of get worse in the winter. Lots of people, get more sick in the winter, influenza, this kind of stuff. And there is this kind of atmosphere, I think, at the moment, in particular this year, a kind of crisis atmosphere around the NHS. And these kinds of things, very interestingly, coexist around the anniversaries of the service with a much more kind of upbeat, celebratory tone for this institution that, like you say, is beloved by many, many British people. It very regularly tops opinion polls of the things that make British people most proud to be British, ahead of the royal family and the armed forces and all these other kinds of things that you might think of. So it's very interesting kind of thinking about this moment of sort of the challenges facing the NHS at the point of an anniversary, where many people will also be kind of celebrating the NHS and the principles that lay behind it.
How does that fit into the stories we're seeing about nurse pay in Great Britain? I mean, is that the COVID effects? Is that part of why labor on the healthcare front is bearing some of the brunt?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things that's kind of it's kind of hard to untangle from the pandemic, but again, it is a kind of pre-existing issue. So real wages in the UK have been pretty much stagnant since 2010 when the Conservative Party came into power. So they've been in power here for about 13 years. And wages for nurses are absolutely no exception to that. And in fact, in sort of real terms, inflation is very, very high here in the UK, higher than it is in the US, have fallen over that period. And particularly once you kind of get outside the other side of the pandemic, you're really seeing the effects of low wages for nurses in particular. Although saying that yesterday, senior doctors also signaled that they were going to go on strike here. So this is a thing that's affecting many parts of the health service. But the nurses issue is an interesting one because this is also happening in other countries. So in Canada, for example, this year, they had a big crisis in their emergency rooms. That was sort of partly, depending on who you ask, or mainly caused by staff shortages in things like nurses, and pay is a huge issue for nurses, I think, in many industrialized countries. I mean, but this has been the case for decades, that these are people that make a health system work on an everyday basis, and yet we simply don't pay them enough. And so the strike action that we're kind of seeing rumbling through the NHS at the moment, I think is a consequence of those workers saying that, they're not going to put up with that anymore, particularly in the context of a cost of living crisis, which is going on in the UK at the moment.
In this 13 year of Conservative rule, I mean, what is the story to be told about the NHS and what has happened during that prolonged period of the Tories holding power?
So when the Conservatives came in, they came in after 13 years of a Labour government. And during that time, NHS spending went up to its highest proportion compared to GDP of all time across that 13 years. And there were many parts of Labour's approach to the NHS, which lots of people on the left disagreed with, bringing in more private companies, this kind of stuff. But certainly on spending, it is unquestionable that was a real improvement historically. And it really did lead to things like, inpatient waiting times that were for things that were like 13 weeks when they came in. They fell to 4 weeks when they went out after that 13 years. So there were these improvements, and patient satisfaction with the service was very high. Then when the Conservatives came in, they kind of inherited this situation. Obviously, this is now the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash. There's a kind of austerity agenda that the Conservatives are driving, as are many European countries at this point. And the budget increases for the NHS across the 2010s dramatically fall compared to that prior period under the Labour Party. So there is a stark reduction in funding that's going on. So across the 2010s, NHS spending as a proportion of GDP falls, has its biggest reduction since the late 1950s. So it's very, very stark kind of reductions in those budget increases. And that has all these knock-on effects. So staff recruitment, upgrading medical buildings and facilities, all these kinds of things that obviously then when the pandemic hits, you really see the consequences of those playing out. Another important thing to mention is that the Conservative government passes a Health and Social Care Act in 2012, which basically tried to kind of open up the system to greater competition from private companies, charities, voluntary groups, sort of non-state healthcare providers. And there was a lot of anxiety at the time that this was going to be the end of the NHS, that it was going to be completely privatized. And that actually hasn't proved to be the case. There was a kind of spike in independent providers outside of the NHS getting more money after the Act was passed in 2012. But actually that kind of quickly fell away. And so I suppose there, on a more optimistic note, it's not actually that simple to open up the NHS completely to private competition. It is this institution that is popular. It has a significant degree of institutional resilience, and also it has many, many defenders, of course, among the general public, but of course, thinking about trade unions, activists, campaigners who kind of went out there and resisted the, what they perceived to be the harmful effects of that legislation.
And for my own edification and education on this, what does it look like to opt out and essentially go towards a private plan? How does that affect the funding mechanism for the NHS?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as a British citizen, you're entitled to free access to the NHS at any point, so you don't have to kind of show an insurance card or pay into, this national insurance, which is like a small sum that you pay on your pay packet every month, but there's no kind of insurance requirement. But of course, many people choose to take out, some people, I should say, choose to take out private health insurance as a way of getting treatment quicker on the NHS than the NHS could provide, or getting, particularly in those kind of like high demand treatments. So things like hip surgery, for example, which is always a very in-demand surgery in an aging population. The waiting lists on the NHS are quite long, so some people will choose to kind of pay privately or take out private insurance. Historically, and in recent years, the number of people that have taken out private insurance in the UK is about 10%. We don't have clear data on this at the moment, but it does seem to be the case that some people, that more people are choosing to take out private health insurance because of the pressures on the NHS at the moment. But usually what you see is that people will do a bit of a mix. So they'll go to their local NHS doctor if they've got a cold or if their kid's ill or whatever it is. And then if there's a kind of procedure that they want done that has a kind of high waiting list on the NHS, they'll pay for it privately and get insurance out for that. So it's kind of a bit of a mix. But we have seen, again, to maybe strike a slightly more optimistic note, we've seen these kinds of spikes before in the NHS's history in private health insurance uptake. But once the pressures on the NHS have been relieved, so I mentioned that Labour period between 1997 and 2010, there was, again, kind of rising uptake of private health insurance before that because of all the pressures under Conservative rule before Labour came back in. Once Labour got back in, the private health insurance numbers of people getting that actually fell. So again, we've got a general election here next year. It might be the case that if the Labour Party win, and the opinion polls suggest that they will, although you can never count on that, it might be the case that if they get back in and the funding goes back up and there's reform, that private health insurance might become less important.
Is it also partially to blame, or is New Labour, I should say, partially to blame in the fact that during the 90s and 2000s, the left party, right, the major leftish party in the UK was broadly accepting of conservative, free market, neoliberal thought? Is it your assessment that some of the actions they did or did not take during that period opened the NHS up to some of what you're seeing now, even though you've made a great case for how durable the program is?
I think this is kind of $1 million question, really, about that New Labour era, and the kind of clues in the title. They sort of rebranded themselves as New Labour, taking inspiration from the New Democrats in the 1990s, people like Clinton and so on. And they certainly carried on many of the kind of policy trajectories that were in place in health that were established under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s or her successor in the early 1990s. So, for example, one would be outsourcing in-house NHS work, hospital work. So things like cleaning. Margaret Thatcher put that out to sort of private companies to do. New Labour sort of carried on that practice when they came into power. But they also sort of created new forms of marketization. So one would be what's known as the Private Finance Initiative, which was basically this policy where New Labour politicians were like, okay, the public want new hospitals, they want new infrastructure, they want facilities. How do we afford that? Well, so what we're going to do is we're going to encourage these kind of consortiums of sort of private equity firms, construction companies, hedge funds, these kinds of people to fund it. And then we will basically pay them a really big loan over, some of these contracts are about 50 years. And, you know, parts of the NHS will be paying them off until sort of the mid 21st century. So there certainly was, you know, you can't deny that there certainly were parts of the New Labour stewardship of the NHS where they did carry on this kind of older neoliberal approach. But one of the things that I sort of argue in my book is that actually I think that broadly, all things balanced out, I think the approach of New Labour to the NHS was broadly social democratic. So I mentioned the funding, the fact that they brought it historically to the highest levels. The staffing went up. And also they also did a lot to further embed the place of the NHS culturally in the UK. So things like putting the NHS on coins or stamps, or holding kind of services for it in Westminster Abbey, these kinds of things. And it kind of seems ephemeral and unimportant, but I think a kind of celebration of a welfare institution by and encouraging that popular celebration, you can't discount that to adding in resilience to it as a system, I think, in a longer term.
Yeah.
And so I think that my argument is that overall they were broadly social democratic, but I think there are certainly ways that many of the things that they were doing were also neoliberal.
I mean, but that also does speak to the fact that it was politically viable for them to put it on coins, to emphasize the NHS as a part of the Labour's going to protect the NHS. And then I think, you know, we're kind of working backwards in history here, but that's also the same reason on the other side that the NHS was able to survive Margaret Thatcher's era in the 80s, because, I mean, she was not shy about aggressive anti-worker, pro-wealthy reforms, and yet despite the sustained pressure on the NHS, it survived.
The Margaret Thatcher story with the NHS is a very interesting one, because this is kind of the beast that she couldn't slay, right? She kind of privatized the nationalized coal industry and set that in motion, privatized things like British telecoms, selling off sort of social housing, this sort of stuff. But the NHS, you know, withstood her designs on it. And there is one of the things that I show in the book, and it's sort of for the first time by going to look in the Conservative Party archives, is there actually was this pretty sustained and long-term thinking within the Conservative Party, working with think tanks on the right and parts of the medical profession who wanted to get rid of the NHS to shift the UK to a private health insurance model. Margaret Thatcher was a great fan of actually the US healthcare system. And one of the things that, incredibly. And one of the things that you see that's really interesting that happens in the 1980s is you see this quite effective linking by the defenders of the NHS of Margaret Thatcher's plans for a private healthcare model to American medicine.
Yes.
And you see this kind of upswing in things like documentary programs, or you see it in newspapers, that people start becoming more and more aware of the kind of inequities, both in terms of class and race, of the US medical system. And that kind of bogs down Margaret Thatcher's plans. And it's this kind of deliberate strategy, actually, by the left, and it's a very, very effective one, to give the NHS the kind of resilience that it needed in that very difficult point of the 1980s.
Can you touch more on the fact that the United States and our private model, which is horrible on outcomes, horrible on costs, in pretty much every metric you want to talk about, infant mortality. You want to talk about rates of disease, rates, life expectancy, and cost. The United States is terrible when it comes to healthcare compared to other industrialized nations, as they say. I mean, that's appealing, I'm sure, to someone like Margaret Thatcher, who wanted everything privatized. But how did the United States import this kind of thinking into conservative thought in the UK? And like, how did that come to be? And what were some of those influences?
So how does the NHS feature in the
Yes.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting story, and sort of one of the chapters of the book is about the place of the NHS in US debate, actually. And so the closest that the US comes to a universal healthcare system is under President Truman after the Second World War. So Roosevelt, as part of the New Deal reforms in the 1930s, tried or was inclined to put a form of universal healthcare into social security legislation, but then the American Medical Association basically threatened him, and he sort of backed off of it. Truman comes in, he's a big believer in it after the Second World War. He tries to pass this form of national health insurance, as most industrialized countries in the West are doing at this point after the Second World War. And what you see is, and there are many explanations as to why that didn't work, and why the US didn't kind of have a system of universal healthcare, from the legacies of domestic slavery and Jim Crow to the political culture in the US, to the size and geography of the place. But one of the other reasons, one of the things that I point out in the book, is actually foreign examples and their importance to debate. And the number one foreign example in the Truman moment was the British NHS, which was set up in 1948, pretty much exactly at this point that Truman is trying to pass a form of national health insurance. Now, the story that we kind of know about is the American Medical Association sending over all of these kind of doctors and journalists and so on to kind of study the NHS, and they would take kind of glossy photographs of waiting rooms and so on, and use them quite deliberately to show, how overcrowded and bureaucratic and terrible this system was. But one of the things we know less about, and what I talk about in the book, is actually the story on the left. And there were a lot of kind of trade unionists and medical activists that also traveled to the UK and did their own studies of the NHS. And there were particular parts of the system that they were very inspired by. And they took those stories back to the US and tried to kind of advance their own cause of national health insurance in the US through the example of the NHS. So it becomes this kind of battleground. And even during Medicare and Medicaid, it sort of crops up again, those debates in the 1960s. After that point, once you get into the 1980s, Canada becomes a little bit more of a center of the kind of key comparison to the US when those kind of external examples are being looked for. But even recently, I think it was Sarah Palin who was sort of in the Obamacare discussions was sort of bringing in the NHS as sort of saying that that the NHS used these kind of death panels to decide who should live and who should die. So the NHS has sort of long been this kind of stick that conservatives have used to kind of beat the cause of universal healthcare. But I suppose thinking about it historically is that there is also a kind of left-wing tradition of thinking about models like the NHS, not the only one, but certainly a significant one. And, I suppose the question there in the future is, is there a way that the left in the US can be thinking about other models and drawing inspiration from that to advance the cause of universal healthcare in the future?
Well, I think that kind of brings us full circle here to the NHS's foundation in 1948. And what was it about the approach of its implementation where I know that it was done incredibly quickly and it was done without apology? What can we in the United States learn as we continue our fight for universal health care and socialized medicine?
Yeah, so the NHS is, as you said, is brought in on the 5th of July 1948, and so it's the 75th anniversary next week, and it was enacted by a Labour government after the Second World War. So it's a surprise. So I did my doctorate in the US, and so at NYU, and I taught British history there, and it was always a surprise speaking to students that. One of the things that they were very surprised to learn is that Winston Churchill didn't win the general election after the Second World War. In fact, he was thrown out in favor of the Labour Party, which promised this very, very radical program of social reform, including a national health service. And so they come in 1945, they pass the legislation in 46, they give themselves 2 years for it to sort of come in. You see all of this kind of opposition. We talked about the AMA in the US, the BMA, the British Medical Association, opposed the British National Health Service because they thought it would be kind of state control and bureaucracy and all these kinds of arguments that we're familiar with. But eventually,
and they're comprised of doctors too, right? Who are worried about their bottom line.
Absolutely. The loss of income. What does that mean? All these kinds of things. Yeah. So, it does come in, and but I think one of the things that is particularly interesting in looking at the history of it is that you would think that if you say to people, oh, we can cover the entire cost of all your medical bills, and we will run the hospitals and we will run the health centers, and we'll give you a kind of functional, efficient health system, that everyone would be like, oh, yes, please, that would be fantastic. But actually, if you look at opinion polls and diaries and all these kinds of things that I have for the book, you see that certainly there's a majority of people that think that. But there is also a sizable minority, say like 30% of people, that actually have these apprehensions about the system. They're worried about what does it mean for the government to take over healthcare or fund healthcare or organize healthcare. And so what the Labour government had to do is it had to go out there and address those apprehensions. So one of the things that I talk about a lot in the book is how there was actually this huge political campaign and almost this kind of cultural campaign, what we would now call sort of public relations, to sort of promote the NHS through the technologies of the time, film, posters, newspaper advertisements, these kinds of things, to sort of promote this system, not as this kind of statist sort of bureaucratic nightmare, but as this thing that was kind of humane, futuristic, it would help families. So I think one of the lessons there, it seems to me, and this I think is only true when we think about how Obamacare played out, is that there does have to be this kind of public relations campaign that is alongside it, that is taking head on those criticisms from the right, that any government involvement in healthcare will inevitably lead to sort of bureaucracy and waiting lists and impersonal care, all this kind of stuff. You need to meet that threat head on, and you need to challenge them, and you need to put across your own justifications for why there should be universal healthcare. So I think that for me is the real takeaway lesson.
Andrew Seaton, research fellow in history at St. Anne's College, author of Our NHS, A History of Britain's Best Loved Institution. We'll put a link to your book in the description of this show, where you're listening or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much, Andrew, for your time today.
Thanks, Emma.
All right, guys, quick break. And when we come back, we are going to be speaking to Camille Rey. We are back, and we are joined now by Camille Rey, who is the mother of her trans son, Leon, who has been outspoken about her family's decision to leave Texas. Camille, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate you opening up and speaking about your family's experience.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start there. I mean, we've been covering the hundreds and hundreds of anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans bills throughout the country that just in this calendar year. And Texas passed a trans gender-affirming care ban for minors back in May. So your family had to make a really tough decision. What led you to this moment?
Well, it really wasn't tough in the moment in a way, because it was so obvious that we and our rights were in danger that it made it very easy to decide to leave, because that's not the environment I wanted to raise my child in. And it's not where I felt I could be a parent, that I could make the best medical decisions for my child. If I couldn't do that, why would I stay? So in that sense, it was easy.
And still, though, I mean, it's a massive upheaval. And I mean, you spoke in your Daily Beast interview a bit about how you saw this coming as other states were beginning to pass their own gender-affirming transition care bans, particularly for minors, but not exclusively. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say that's right. I grew up in Texas. I know what the politics is like. And when I saw that Arkansas was the first state to pass such a ban, I knew that was going to happen in Texas. And sure enough, I went online, I found that the bills had already been introduced. I just hadn't heard of them yet. And so that's when I decided to try to fight them in the hopes that I could stay in Texas. However, it did become clear during the fight that this issue was not going away. And even back then in 2021, when the bill, at least for banning gender-affirming medical care for minors, was defeated, the parents around me said, we were here 2 years ago fighting the bathroom bill. This is not going away. We'll be back in another 2 years fighting the same bills. And I said, that is not a way to live. It's just horrible. It was causing Leon stress. He had chronic stomach aches. He missed so much of second grade that he barely passed it. And I was stressed. I didn't know what was coming next. The parents around me were starting to create safe folders, or I'm not even sure what they were called, but these documents in case Child Protective Services came knocking at your door. You had evidence gathered in a folder that you're a good parent. And right. I was like, yeah, no, I'm out.
I mean, so how old is Leon now?
Leon is now 10.
Right. And I mean, I was in the Daily Beast interview. He was talking about how he loves playing basketball and loves basketball. And one of the bills that pass is a ban on trans kids participating in sports. What does that say to your child? That,
right.
Leon is a boy, but for some reason the state has said, well, not really a boy, and you don't get to be a part of like the social structures that your friends are a part of. I mean, what does that feel like for him?
It feels terrible, and in a way, luckily, he's too young to fully articulate it, but he's not too young to feel it, and you can hear in the question at the time. So when we were in Texas, that was the only piece of legislation that did pass, the ban on minor children playing on the sports team that aligned with their gender. And when that passed, he was playing on a team at the Y, but it was a co-ed team. But still, he said to me, because he doesn't understand that all the nuances then, he was 8 at the time. He said, does that mean I don't get to play basketball? So, what it means for him is that he knows that people are against him even existing. And that is, I don't understand how that's not completely devastating and paralyzing. But he's a kid and he's resilient and he doesn't know any better. But, if someone started treating me that way, I don't know how I would get up in the morning.
I mean, can you talk a bit about your family's process as you knew that Leon was transitioning or was a boy? What that was like and your family's story leading up to where you had to make this decision.
Right. So it was the beginning of the pandemic. We were all in the house a lot together and we were just hanging out one day. And I was talking to Leon's older sister about the importance of loving yourself. And Leon pipes up in the background and says, but I don't love myself. And that just didn't make sense to me as his mom. I've been watching this kid be, super gregarious, outgoing. I called him the ambassador of the family because he would bring friends to us. He was just that much of the life of the party kind of personality. And you're like, how can you not love yourself? You're only 7, And so, he had already started wearing his hair short, but so did his sister. But he started refusing her sparkly hand-me-downs, the T-shirts I would buy with, pink flamingos. And he was like, can you just buy me a gray T-shirt? I'm like, sure. I didn't know much about what it meant to be transgender. And I didn't know that the children know at such a young age, that we've assigned them the wrong gender. And so I just thought, well, someday when it's time to date, we'll have some issue with sexuality. And I didn't realize that it was a gender issue. And anyway, that day I asked him if he would like to see his sister's therapist, and he said yes. And I was like, okay, again, this makes no sense. Why would a 7-year-old want to go to therapy? But he knew something was wrong. And later he told me, I just knew I wasn't who you expected me to be. And so, but in therapy, we both learned eventually about transgender identity, and the therapist recommended a children's book for him, and he read it, and a few days later he came to me and said, do you think I'm, and I said, well, it doesn't matter what I think, it matters what you think. I knew what he was talking about, being transgender, and he couldn't talk. He had a panic attack. Again, 7 years old, you're like watching all these things that you don't expect. And I said, well, why don't I say it and you shake your head yes or no? And I said, do you think you're transgender? And he shook his head yes. And in that moment, I was just like, well, okay, we'll figure it out and we'll get you what you need. That was kind of my attitude. And
yeah.
And at first it was a process to include the family in this revelation and realization. But he took us right along really quickly. By the end of the summer, this was in May, by the end of the summer, we had his new name, his new pronouns, his gender marker changed on his birth certificate. Everyone in our immediate circle accepted him. The people who had all known him with a different name were now using the new name. Our family, grandparents, everyone was on board, and everything was fine. I did take him out of the school system because I had heard, that no transgender child had ever stayed in that school system because it was unwelcoming. It's not the Austin proper, but out in the hill country. And so we made that change, and everything was moving fine until this legislation was introduced. And that's what people have to understand, that even it being introduced is harmful. Even having this conversation, questioning someone's existence is harmful. Much less actually passing the bills, of course, is a whole nother level of harm. But we suffered just from being in that environment.
I mean, it makes total sense. And I'm just so struck by how you speak really plainly about you just essentially responding to what your son was telling you, because so much of the anti-trans panic is focused on parental rights. What are we going to do about the parents, when it's really about parents? How are you going to treat your children with respect and agency and hear what they have to say about their lives and internalize it without rejecting it? It's just good parenting. That's the bottom line.
Right. And, Leon is my third child. And of course, I've made many mistakes before, and I'll make many mistakes coming. But by then I was very clear that my children are not mini-me's. They're on their own journey. And I had always treated all of them, with respect as far as their choices, as things that they could choose, how to express themselves. Were they interested in piano? Did they like fish? I mean, whatever it was, I was going to encourage it. And so I was actually shocked that here I thought I was being a parent that lets their children express themselves, that lets their children be who they are, gives them the space and the room to do that. But yet I had actually been unknowingly putting expectations on Leon that were weighing on him. He knew he wasn't living up to my expectations. And if you had asked me, I would have said, I have no expectations. But of course we do. In this society, we totally think in a binary way. We totally think about gender. I mean, we have gender reveal parties. I mean,
yeah,
it's so ingrained. And how we back up from that as parents and even as a society I have no idea. But I'm here and I'm willing to help people figure it out as I figure it out.
Well, I mean, I appreciate you speaking about this because it's just really helpful to hear your experience. And I just wanted to know if you'd be okay talking a bit about what gender affirming care looks like for Leon, because again, we combat the right wing every day on the show, and it's mutilation, like they post photos of surgeries as if like, yeah, surgery is bloody sometimes, it's a little gross, it's that way for knee replacements, it's that way for rhinoplasties, but in terms of Leon's care calendar, what can you tell us about that, because I think that might be helpful for people to understand.
Sure. So I happened to be at a comedy show this past weekend in DC, and it tells you how mainstream the issue of transgender identity has become, that the comic was making jokes about transgender. But in his show, he said something to the effect of giving hormones to 3-year-olds. I was like, yeah, no.
Right.
I understand needing to be funny, but that's not funny. It wasn't funny to me because it's so inaccurate. And so what gender affirming care looks like at the beginning is basically social transition. So it's allowing the child to change their hairstyle, their clothing styles, use different pronouns, that sort of thing. It's completely social. At some point, well, right before puberty, that basically if you have the care you need, your physician is monitoring your child for signs of puberty. When they do start to show signs of puberty, then you have the decision and the discussion whether to start puberty blockers so that the child does not go through changes in their body that will be very upsetting to them, and actually is a medical diagnosis of body dysmorphia. And this is just where you feel uncomfortable in your skin, and those kinds of changes would be really upsetting. And so when those changes do occur, the physician, the counselor or a therapist, the parents, even the child, get together and say, here are your options. What do we do? And so for Leon, we all decided together that puberty blockers would be the way to go. These are reversible. Yep. They give the child and the family more time to figure out, are we on the right track here with your gender identity? Do you feel comfortable this way? It's a question, and we always want to leave room, for different answers. And so the puberty blockers give us the time and the space to do that. And so that's what he's on now. Eventually, it'll be time, in the teenage years to switch to hormone therapy, in which he would get testosterone, if we decide that. Not everyone has to do that. Everyone's path is different. This is not like you jump on the train and then you can't get off. You can get off anytime. We do not do surgery. Nobody does surgery. Surgery is not the standard of care for minors. So that this tells you right there, anyone who's talking about that and knows better is just trying to scare you. Anyway, I'm not even going to say the words, but it's just not standard of care. It may be prescribed very late in the teen years for someone who really has severe dysmorphia. If it's a matter between this person staying alive and having some kind of surgery, mostly that would be top surgery. And even less common would be any kind of bottom surgery. Really is after 18. It really is. And I'm not a medical doctor, but this is my understanding as a parent who has done the research. But please, I'm not trying to be an expert, but I am trying to say from where I sit, surgery is very rare.
No, well, everything that I've researched in my time, covering the news is the calendar that you describe is exactly what the standard of care is. And again, these right wingers don't talk about breast augmentations, which happen underage, breast reductions, which happen underage, which is equivalent to a top surgery. And even that is happening in incredibly rare instances. And a ban on gender affirming care in practice, that is just going to increase levels of gender dysphoria, as you describe, gender dysphoria, which would have and has documented to have incredibly negative mental health effects, and is a really big part of increased suicidal attempt and suicidal ideation rates among trans kids, because they're unable to socially transition in the way or that fits best with their vision for themselves. This is just about empowering children and families to determine this kind of calendar of care for those kids.
Yeah, and I think everyone can identify with the fact they would like their insides to match their outsides. I mean, everyone chooses a hairstyle, everyone chooses their wardrobe. Everyone chooses how to express themselves, even in whether they play the piano or they play sports. Children, everyone should have that right.
Yeah. Lastly, before I let you go, you've moved to the DC area, right? I guess you've already made that move, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, I wonder if you could reflect on other families in your position who might not have the ability to move, and what that really means for. I know it was an easy decision for you, and I understand that. It's just there's going to be a lot more people who are going to be forced to make that choice. What's your message to them, and if it's not workable for them?
Right.
How does that go?
So I just want to clarify. There's two things. There's a difference between it was an easy decision and whether the process itself has been easy, which it has not. It has been soul crushing, to be honest, and it's still ongoing. And I'm not in Texas near my family as they age and pass away. Weddings and funerals. I mean, there's. And issues that come up in my life where I wish they were closer to me, health scares or whatever, so it hasn't been easy. And for the people who can't leave, I can't tell you how much that weighs on me. And which is why I say yes to all these interviews, because they can't speak. They cannot speak out for fear of being targeted politically, physically. It's terrible. And it makes me angry that happens in our country. I mean, we talk about free speech. They don't have free speech right now.
Right. Yeah, it's an incredibly scary time. I'm glad you were able to make this move, and you're, a great mom. So thank you, Camille. I really appreciate your time and taking the time to tell us a little bit about your family today.
Yeah, anytime.
Have a good one. All right. With that, we are going to wrap up the first hour of this program. We will head into the fun half.
If we had a media that was actually aimed toward helping people work through societal difficulties, we'd hear a lot more from people like Camille and Dwayne Wade, and a lot less from Matt Walsh or Matt Taibbi or all these freaks who are using this issue that is driving families apart when they can't react as adult as Camille did.
Right.
And yeah, amazing story. And a tragic one.
And right. Exactly. We are displacing people in the continental United States, or within our 50 states.
Yes.
These are people who are interstate refugees.
Right. For all
asylum seekers.
All the families like Camille and Dwayne Wade, they have the material ability to do this and make it, and it's still not easy.
And it's still traumatic.
Yeah,
there's still all of that.
Exactly. You're still a refugee in your own effing country.
And yeah, Camille had to make a choice of being farther away from her other family members. That is insane. That is something that has to be done in this nation. And it's all because of religious bigots and psychopaths. Anyway, we will have some fun though in the fun half. The number is 646-257-3920. Matt, Left Reckoning? What happened on Left Reckoning?
Left Reckoning, we had Yasha Levine on, a great journalist who wrote Surveillance Valley, talking about Russia, how to understand that this conflict both as an unjust invasion and one that's going to coarsen both sides of society and absolutely fail to denazify anything or in the area, as well as like a proxy war where both sides are getting more and more comfortable with war as a status quo. And then also the Prigozhin mutiny and what we can what significance that may have. It's probably too early to say at this point. But patreon.com/leftreckoning for that.
And on ESPN, we spoke about some of the NBA trades that happened. We ripped into the NHL for being ridiculous and banning pride jerseys. And we did a really fun breakdown of over-under win totals for the NFL season. We went through every team, what we expect of them. Way too early, but never too early to get excited about football in the fall. YouTube.com/ESPN show. Now, whoa, seamless. Good job, guys. What's up, Binder and Brandon?
That was like magic.
Hello.
What'd you say?
That was like magic.
It was like magic. What's up,
How
guys?
you doing, Matt and Brandon and the disgusting Emma Vigeland?
The woke lady
Disturbing.
herself.
Disturbing.
The disturbing woke lady.
Disturbing. I'm sorry.
Disturbing.
I get them. You know, he probably could have called you disgusting.
I know. But I take great pride in it, so I want the disturbing moniker to make the rounds.
The woke lady.
Right.
That too.
I haven't seen a lady this woke since South Africa.
He took a break from grappling YouTubers to tweet about your appearance. So you should feel very honored.
I know. It's so funny. And I doubt he even watched it. Not that it would matter, but they say I'm advocate for porn for children, and there's no quotation marks, oddly, in the tweet that he responded to. It's super weird that they didn't use any direct quotes from me. Huh.
Less of a quote, more of a vibe, I guess you give off.
Yeah. Well, I guess I give off the pedo vibe, which is why Tim wanted to hang out so badly afterwards.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
We will talk about that.
She was offered a tour, sushi, and poker with the boys.
Wow. You didn't want to hang out on his compound? Why? On a scale of 0 to 1, did you correct it? How compoundy was it?
Well, I mean, Binder, did you get a tour of the skate park?
I mean, I did, but I also requested to see it because I wanted to see it.
Okay, well, I was trying to get the fuck out of there, so I'm
a connoisseur of free food, so I probably would have taken him up on the free sushi offer without a doubt.
I mean, I kind of have a bit of a snobby policy about sushi, but I'm not really into landlocked states providing me with sushi. I'm just putting that out there. That's all.
Where is he again? West Virginia?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, West Virginia sushi on, Hat Man's compound. No,
it's not far from DC. It's not far, but I mean, that paired with my complete lack of desire to chill there was enough for me to boot. And I wanted to call into the Majority Report pretty badly afterwards. So, anyway. What's happening on the discourse, Brandon?
Yes, we'll have an episode for you tomorrow where we talk about Trump's indictments, the likelihood that they will impact his run for presidency. We talk a little bit about the debate, as well as the Titanic sub-tragedy. And, we draw some comparisons between those. And, it's just a good time. So that'll be out for you probably by end of day tomorrow. I've been going to the gym a lot more. So, I've had to just put editing to the side. But
good for you. There we go.
Yeah, you got to promulgate these guns.
All right. He's a Second Amendment absolutist, Brandon.
Absolutely.
Binder, what's happening on Doomed and Scam Economy?
Well, on Doomed this
and
past,
Leftist Mafia. Sorry.
Oh, right. Yes. No, a lot going on. Right. So on Doomed this past week, I had on from Russian writer Igor Kotkin. He called me directly from Moscow to give me an on-the-ground sort of feeling, like a personal experience about what was going through his mind when everything
I didn't
was
know
going
Igor
on.
was. Sorry to jump in. I didn't know Igor was actually in Moscow. Damn.
Yes.
Wow.
So, he had a lot to say, things I had not heard about, just to throw one random thing out there that was very interesting was he claimed that, Wagner Group was using robocalls to try to drum up support during that day. They have a whole bot apparatus for various disinformation campaigns. So definitely check that out at youtube.com/MattBinder and doomedcast.com. New Scam Economy episode will be coming out very soon. I promise you. And it's going to be a good one. I promise you it'll be out soon. Leftist Mafia tonight. I believe our guest tonight is everyone who's a YouTube, hardcore YouTube leftist watcher might know FD Signifier will be on the show. Emma Vigeland will hopefully be on the show very soon. If you've heard of her.
Yes, Joe's Rogaine wrote in and says, Emma, when will you go on Leftist Mafia? I want to do that soon.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll make
but I
it
got to get an
happen for
invite, so could have come on tonight. But now I can't.
They already had this guest lined up.
Yeah.
I mean, after signifier Emma, you got to get in line.
I guess
You
I'm
gotta
not
invite
that
the
big of a
Tim Pool
deal,
first.
huh? What'd you say, Brandon?
You got a Tim Pool invite before a Leftist Mafia invite. That's crazy.
I know, right?
Well, we're not big fans of those heterodoxical views that Emma Vigeland.
Right, shit lib stuff.
Emma should brand herself as a contrarian.
Yes.
Just like keep her same opinions.
Right, exactly. But then maybe I could get some like Rumble money and then just run away with it after, and then say everything they don't want to hear. All right, cool. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun.
Are you ready?
Who sent us
this? Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflakes has what?
The alpha males are back.